The morning mist clung to the redwood trees, like ghostly fingers, as Chief Katsuka moved silently through the forest with his hunting party. The Cahto village lay 3 miles behind them, nestled in the valley where the Eel River curved through ancient groves. At 42 winters, Katsuka had seen many seasons of peace, but the scars on his chest told stories of battles fought to protect his people from neighboring tribes and the increasing presence of white settlers pushing inland. His daughter Ayana walked beside him, her small hand trailing along the rough bark of trees as they moved. Born without sight, she had learned to navigate the world through touch, sound, and an inner knowing that often surprised even her father. Her mother had died bringing her into this world, and Katsuka had raised her with the help of his sister and the village women. Despite her blindness, Ayana possessed a spirit that burned bright, learning the songs of their ancestors, the medicinal properties of plants, and the ancient stories that kept their culture alive. The hunting party consisted of 12 men, all experienced warriors who had sworn loyalty to their chief. They moved with purpose today, not just seeking deer or elk, but investigating reports from their scouts about strangers camping near the sacred springs 2 valleys over. These were not the usual white trappers or traders who occasionally passed through their territory with proper respect and small gifts. The scouts spoke of armed men who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake. As they crested a ridge overlooking the disputed area, Katsuka raised his hand, signaling the party to halt. Below them, smoke rose from what had once been a peaceful camping ground used by traveling families. The acrid smell carried on the wind told him it was not the clean smoke of cooking fires, but the bitter scent of burned belongings and worse things he did not want to imagine. Through the trees, he could see movement. Men on horseback, their faces hard and weathered, were systematically searching through the remains of what appeared to have been a small group of travelers. These were not soldiers or official men, but something worse, raiders who lived by taking from others, recognizing no law but their own greed. Katsuka counted 8 of them, all armed with rifles and pistols, their horses strong and well-fed while their clothes bore the stains of violence and neglect. Their leader, a tall man with a beard streaked with gray, directed the others with sharp gestures and harsh words that carried up the hillside, even though Katsuka could not understand their meaning. What caught the chief's attention, however, was not just the raiders themselves, but what they had found. Near the center of their camp, partially hidden behind an overturned wagon, he could see figures that did not belong to the raider band. Captives. His heart tightened as he recognized the pattern. These men had attacked travelers, killed some, and taken others to sell or use as they saw fit. Ayana touched his arm gently, her senses alert to the tension in his body. She could not see the scene below, but she could feel the anger and concern radiating from her father and the other warriors. Her fingers found his wrist, and she pressed lightly, a signal they had developed over the years. She was asking if there was danger and whether she should move to the safe position they had practiced. Katsuka covered her hand with his, acknowledging her question but indicating she should stay close. His mind raced as he considered their options. The raiders outnumbered his hunting party, and they held an advantageous position in the clearing. More importantly, any direct attack might result in the death of the captives before they could be rescued. He gestured to his men, using the silent hand signals their people had perfected over generations of hunting and warfare. Half would circle around to approach from the east, while he led the remainder down the direct path. They would wait for his signal before attacking, giving him time to assess the situation and potentially negotiate if that seemed wiser than bloodshed. As they began their careful descent, staying hidden among the dense undergrowth and massive tree trunks, Katsuka found himself thinking about the choices that had led to this moment. His people had always lived by a code that valued life, even the lives of enemies, They fought when necessary to protect their territory and families, but they did not seek conflict for its own sake. These raiders represented something different. Men who had chosen to live outside the bonds of civilization, taking what they wanted without regard for others. The captives came into clearer view as they drew closer. A woman, perhaps 30 winters old, sat with her back against the wagon wheel, her arms wrapped protectively around someone smaller. A child, Katsuka realized, though he could not yet determine if it was a boy or girl. Both appeared unharmed but terrified, their clothing torn and dusty from travel and rough treatment. The woman's eyes constantly scanned the raiders, watching their movements with the alertness of a mother protecting her young. There was something in her posture, in the way she held herself, that reminded Katsuka of a she-wolf he had once encountered while hunting, cornered but not defeated, ready to fight to her last breath for her offspring. One of the raiders approached the captives, speaking in harsh tones and gesturing with his rifle. The woman shrank back but did not release her hold on the child. The raider laughed at her fear, clearly enjoying the power he held over them. He reached out as if to touch the woman's face, and she jerked away, earning another laugh and what appeared to be a threatening gesture. Katsuka felt his jaw clench. Among his people, women were revered as life-givers and keepers of wisdom. To see one treated with such disrespect ignited an anger in his chest that burned like fire. Beside him, Ayana had gone very still, her head tilted as she listened to the sounds drifting up from the camp, the harsh voices, the frightened whimpering, the cruel laughter. The raider leader called out something, and the man near the captives backed away, apparently receiving new orders. They were preparing to move out, Katsuka realized. Once they left this place, tracking them would become much more difficult, and the fate of the captives would be sealed. He made his decision. Raising his bow, he selected an arrow from his quiver and nocked it carefully. Around him, his warriors did the same, their faces grim with purpose. They had the advantage of surprise and superior knowledge of the terrain. If they struck swiftly and with precision, they could end this before the captives were harmed. The signal came as a bird call, perfectly mimicked by one of his men who had circled to the far side of the clearing. The raiders, unfamiliar with the sounds of this forest, paid no attention to what seemed like natural forest noise. They could not have known that death was already flying toward them through the morning air. Katsuka's first arrow took the man nearest the captives through the chest, dropping him silently to the ground. Around the clearing, other arrows found their marks as his warriors struck with deadly accuracy. The raiders, caught completely off guard, stumbled and shouted in confusion before finally understanding they were under attack. The battle was brief but intense. The raiders, despite their superior weapons, were disorganized and had no idea how many attackers they faced or from which directions the assault was coming. 3 fell in the first volley of arrows, and 2 more died as Katsuka's warriors emerged from the forest with war cries that echoed off the surrounding hills. The remaining raiders attempted to retreat to their horses, but found their escape routes blocked by warriors who seemed to appear from nowhere. Only 2 managed to mount their animals, and they fled northward, leaving behind their dead companions and stolen goods in their panic to escape. As the sounds of battle faded and the fleeing horses disappeared into the distance, Katsuka approached the captives cautiously. The woman had pulled the child even closer, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. She could not know if these new arrivals represented rescue or simply a change in captors. Katsuka raised his hands, palms open, in a gesture of peace. He spoke softly in English, words he had learned through trading contacts and occasional dealings with settlers. His voice was gentle, meant to calm rather than frighten. "Safe now," he said, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "Raiders gone. You hurt?" The woman stared at him, taking in his appearance. The traditional leather clothing, the painted symbols on his face, the bow still in his hand. Her grip on the child tightened, but Katsuka could see the intelligence in her eyes as she processed the situation. These men had attacked her captors, not her. It was then that the child stirred in her arms, turning toward the sound of Katsuka's voice. The chief found himself looking into a face that sent shock through his entire being. The child was a girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with features that were unmistakably similar to his own daughter's. But it was not just the physical resemblance that stopped his breath. It was the eyes. They were clouded and unfocused, moving without fixing on anything. This child, like his Ayana, had been born without sight. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he understood suddenly why the woman had fought so desperately to protect her. A blind child would be completely vulnerable in a world of violence and cruelty, dependent entirely on those who loved her for survival. The woman noticed his stare and misinterpreted it as threat. She shifted position, trying to shield the girl completely with her body, her voice rising in desperation. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't hurt her. She's just a child. She can't see. She's not a threat to anyone. Take me instead. Do what you want with me, but let her go. She's innocent." The words cut through Katsuka like knife blades. This woman, this stranger, was begging for her child's life in terms that revealed both the depth of her love and the horror of what she expected. She was prepared to sacrifice herself completely for a daughter who could never be anything but vulnerable in a harsh world. Behind him, Ayana had followed the sound of voices and now stood at his shoulder, her hand finding his arm with practiced ease. She spoke softly in their own language, asking what was happening, why he had stopped moving. The sound of her voice, so similar to what the captive child's might be, made the connection even stronger in Katsuka's mind. He knelt slowly, making himself less imposing, and continued to speak in gentle English. "No hurt," he said carefully. "I have daughter, like yours. Same eyes. I understand." The woman's expression shifted from terror to confusion, then to something that might have been hope. She looked at Ayana, taking in the girl's confident posture despite her obvious blindness, the way she stood close to her father without fear, the sense of security and love that surrounded her. "Your daughter?" she asked hesitantly. Katsuka nodded. "Ayana, born with sky eyes, like yours." He used the phrase his people employed for blindness, which honored rather than diminished the condition. "She sees with heart, hears with spirit. Strong girl. You're strong too, yes?" For the first time since the rescue began, tears started down the woman's cheeks. They were not tears of fear, but of overwhelming relief that someone understood. Someone else knew what it meant to love and protect a child who would always need special care in an unforgiving world. The captive girl stirred again, her head turning toward the voices. She spoke for the first time, her voice small but clear. "Mama, are the bad men gone?" The woman's voice broke as she answered. "Yes, sweetheart. There are new people here, but I think they're good people." Katsuka felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that went beyond the physical similarity between the two blind girls. This moment had become about more than a simple rescue. It was about understanding the sacred responsibility that came with protecting those who could not protect themselves, and the bonds that formed between people who shared that burden. He stood slowly and turned to his men, speaking rapidly in his own language. They nodded and began the process of securing the area, gathering the raiders' weapons and horses, and preparing for the journey back to their village. Some questioned the wisdom of bringing strangers into their territory, but Katsuka's authority as chief was absolute, and his decision was clear. The woman and her daughter would come with them. What happened after that would depend on choices yet to be made, but for now, they would be safe. In a world where safety was never guaranteed, especially for the vulnerable, that was perhaps the greatest gift anyone could offer. As they prepared to leave the scene of battle, Katsuka found himself thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment. The morning had begun as a simple hunting expedition, but it had become something much more significant. He had found himself face to face with a reflection of his own deepest fears and greatest loves, embodied in two strangers who were no longer strangers at all. The sun climbed higher through the redwood canopy as the group began their journey toward the Cahto village, carrying with them the weight of new responsibilities and the promise of choices that would change all their lives forever. The journey to the Cahto village took most of the day, winding through ancient trails that followed the natural contours of the land. Sarah Mitchell, as she had finally introduced herself, walked carefully behind Chief Katsuka, her daughter Emma's hand firmly in hers. The child had grown quiet during the trek, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar sounds and smells of the deep forest, but she showed remarkable courage for one so young. Ayana had taken a position near the strangers, occasionally speaking softly to her father in their native language. Sarah could see the girl's confident navigation of the rough terrain, the way she anticipated obstacles through sound and subtle air currents, and how the warriors automatically adjusted their pace to accommodate both blind children without making them feel burdensome. As they walked, Sarah's mind raced with questions and fears. Who were these people really? She had heard stories about Indian tribes from other settlers, most of them frightening tales of savagery and violence. Yet the reality of her rescue painted a completely different picture. These men had risked their lives to save strangers, and their chief showed a gentleness toward her daughter that spoke of deep understanding and compassion. Her husband Thomas had been killed in the raider attack 3 days ago, along with the other men in their small wagon train. The memory of his final moments, when he had tried desperately to protect his family before being cut down, still caused her chest to tighten with grief. She and Emma had been spared only because the raiders saw value in keeping them alive for trade, or worse purposes she refused to contemplate. Now, walking through this primeval forest with her daughter safely beside her, Sarah felt a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty that left her emotionally exhausted. These people had saved them, but what did they expect in return? What was their ultimate intention? The village appeared suddenly as they crested a small ridge, revealing a sight that took Sarah's breath away. Below them spread a community of perhaps 200 people living in harmony with the natural landscape. Traditional houses built of redwood planks and bark lined the banks of a clear river, while gardens and gathering areas created spaces for communal life. Children played in the shallows, while women worked at various tasks, their voices creating a peaceful hum of daily activity. The arrival of the hunting party created a stir of excitement and curiosity. People emerged from their homes and work areas to see the strangers their chief had brought back. Sarah felt dozens of eyes upon her and Emma, studying them with expressions that ranged from welcoming to cautious to openly curious. An elderly woman with silver hair braided with shells and beads approached them with dignity and authority that marked her as someone of importance. She spoke rapidly to Katsuka in their language, her gestures indicating questions about the newcomers. The chief responded at length, and Sarah caught her own name and Emma's among the unfamiliar words. The woman, who was introduced as Ayana's aunt and the village's senior healer, stepped forward and addressed Sarah directly in surprisingly good English. "I am Wiyot," she said with formal courtesy. "My nephew tells me you and your daughter have suffered greatly. You are welcome in our village while you heal from your wounds, both those that show and those that do not." Sarah felt tears threaten again at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't know how to repay your generosity." Wiyot's weathered face softened. A mother protecting her child needs no payment for sanctuary. Come, we will find you food and rest. As they were led through the village, Sarah became aware of the complex social structure around them. People went about their daily tasks with purpose and organization, but there was also laughter and easy interaction that spoke of a close-knit community. Children ran freely between the houses, supervised by whoever happened to be nearby, while adults shared tools and responsibilities without apparent conflict. Emma walked close beside her mother, her free hand trailing along surfaces as they passed, her acute hearing picking up the sounds of this new environment. A group of children had gathered to stare at the strangers, but their curiosity was innocent rather than hostile. One brave little boy approached and spoke to Ayana in their language, clearly asking about the newcomers. Ayana responded with what sounded like gentle explanations, and soon several children were walking alongside them, maintaining a respectful distance but obviously fascinated by Emma's condition and appearance. Sarah tensed, remembering cruel reactions from other children in the settlements they had passed through, but these young ones seemed different. One girl, perhaps Emma's age, stepped forward and spoke directly to Emma in broken English, offering her hand in greeting. Emma hesitated, looking toward her mother for guidance, before tentatively extending her own hand. The Cahto girl took it gently and began describing the village they were passing through, pointing out sounds and smells that would help Emma orient herself. They were housed in a structure near Wiyot's home, a comfortable dwelling with sleeping platforms covered in soft furs and woven blankets. The walls were decorated with baskets and tools that showed remarkable craftsmanship, and a small fire pit in the center provided warmth and cooking space. It was more comfortable than many places Sarah had slept during their long journey west. That evening, as Emma finally slept peacefully for the first time in days, Sarah found herself invited to join the evening meal with Katsuka's family. Wiyot had provided them with clean clothing in the Cahto style, and Sarah felt strange but somehow right, wearing the soft deerskin dress and leggings that replaced her torn and dirty settler's clothes. Katsuka's home was larger than theirs, reflecting his status as chief, but it maintained the same warm, lived-in feeling of the other village dwellings. Ayana moved about the space with complete confidence, helping to prepare food and serving their guests with the same careful attention her father had shown. The meal consisted of fresh fish from the river, acorn bread, wild greens, and berries that burst with flavor, unlike anything Sarah had tasted before. As they ate, Katsuka asked gentle questions about their journey and what had brought them to his territory. Sarah found herself telling the story of their trek from Missouri, how Thomas had dreamed of farming in the Oregon Territory, and how they had joined with other families for safety on the dangerous journey west. She spoke of the attack with careful control, not wanting to break down in front of these people who had shown them such kindness. When she finished, the fire had burned low, and Emma was curled against her side, drowsing despite her best efforts to stay awake in this fascinating new place. Katsuka listened to everything without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never pushing for details she seemed reluctant to share. "Your husband was a brave man," he said finally. "He fought to protect family. This is good death, even in sorrow." The simple dignity of his words brought comfort that Sarah hadn't expected. In her own culture, people often spoke of Thomas's death as a tragic waste or an unfortunate accident. Katsuka's perspective honored the choice her husband had made to stand against impossible odds for love of his family. Over the following days, Sarah and Emma began to find their place in the rhythm of village life. Wiyot took charge of their integration with the practical wisdom of someone who had seen many changes in her long life. She assigned tasks to Sarah that made use of her skills while teaching her new ones, and she seemed to understand instinctively that useful work would help heal the wounds of grief and trauma. Emma's adjustment proved even more remarkable. The Cahto children. Led by the girl who had first befriended her, created an inclusive environment that allowed Emma to participate in their games and activities. They developed new ways to play that used sound and touch rather than sight, and Emma's sharp mind and gentle nature made her popular among her new friends. Ayanna became a constant companion and guide, sharing the knowledge she had gained over years of navigating the world without sight. She taught Emma to identify plants by touch and smell, to read weather patterns through subtle changes in air pressure and wind direction, and to move confidently through familiar spaces by creating mental maps of sounds and textures. Sarah watched these developments with amazement and growing hope. In her own world, Emma had often been seen as a burden or an object of pity. Here, her blindness was acknowledged, but not treated as a limitation that defined her worth. The children included her naturally in their activities, and the adults spoke to her directly rather than around her as if she couldn't understand. The change in Emma was remarkable to see. The frightened, withdrawn child who had clung to her mother during their captivity began to laugh again, to explore with curiosity rather than fear, and to display the bright intelligence that trauma had temporarily suppressed. She learned Cahto words with the quick facility of childhood, and soon she was chattering away in a mixture of English and native phrases that delighted her new friends. For Sarah, the adjustment proved more complex. Her gratitude to Katsuka and his people was infinite, but she struggled with questions about their future that had no easy answers. The Cahto had accepted them without reservation, but she was still a white woman in Indian territory, and she knew that her presence could potentially bring danger to these people who had shown them such kindness. The reality of the larger world beyond the village began to intrude as traders and messengers brought news from the outside. There were reports of increased tensions between settlers and various tribes, stories of violence and retaliation that created an atmosphere of growing mistrust and fear. Sarah knew that her presence in the village could be misunderstood by both sides if discovered. These concerns came to a head during a council meeting where the village elders gathered to discuss various community issues. Sarah had been invited to attend, both as a sign of respect and because decisions being made might affect her and Emma's situation. She sat quietly in the circle, understanding little of the rapid conversation, but sensing the serious nature of the discussion. Katsuka served as moderator, listening carefully to each speaker before offering his own thoughts. The debate seemed to center around the increasing presence of white settlers in territories traditionally controlled by various tribes and the proper response to these encroachments. Some speakers advocated for stronger resistance, while others argued for negotiation and accommodation. When the discussion turned specifically to Sarah and Emma's presence, she found herself the focus of intense attention. An elderly man spoke at length, gesturing toward her several times with what seemed like concern rather than hostility. Wyatt responded with equally lengthy comments, her tone firm and decisive. Finally, Katsuka addressed Sarah directly in English, his expression serious but kind. "Council discusses your future here," he explained. "Some worry that white woman in village brings danger if soldiers or other whites discover. Others say you and daughter are family now, protected by our law and honor." Sarah's heart clenched with fear and uncertainty. She had been dreading this moment while simultaneously knowing it was inevitable. "What do you think I should do?" she asked quietly. Katsuka considered his words carefully. "I think Emma is happy here, learning much from Ayanna and other children. You work hard, learn our ways, show respect for our customs. But choice must be yours. We do not keep prisoners, even willing ones." The weight of decision settled on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy blanket. She could try to continue west to Oregon, where other settlers might accept them and where Emma could grow up in her own culture. But the journey would be dangerous for a woman alone with a blind child, and there was no guarantee of the kind of acceptance and understanding they had found here. Alternatively, she could stay with the Cahto and accept the risks that came with that choice. Emma was thriving in ways Sarah had never imagined possible, and she herself had found a sense of purpose and community that she had lost when Thomas died. But she knew her presence could potentially bring conflict to these peaceful people. That night, as she struggled with the decision, Sarah found herself sitting by the river that flowed through the village center. The sound of moving water had always helped her think, and she needed clarity now more than ever. The future seemed to branch into multiple paths, each carrying its own promises and dangers. Emma found her there, moving confidently along the familiar path from their dwelling to the water's edge. Her daughter had developed an uncanny ability to sense her mother's moods and needs, perhaps sharpened by her reliance on non-visual cues. "Mama," Emma said, settling beside her on the smooth stones that lined the bank, "are we going to stay here?" The question Sarah had been dreading came with the direct simplicity that children brought to complex situations. "What do you think, sweetheart? Are you happy here?" Emma considered this seriously, her young face thoughtful in the moonlight. "I like Ayana. She teaches me things, and the other children play with me like I'm just Emma, not blind Emma. But I miss Papa." The honesty of her daughter's response brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. Emma was thriving here, but she was still a child who had lost her father and been through terrible trauma. No amount of kindness from their new friends could erase that pain completely. "I miss Papa too," Sarah said, pulling Emma close. "But I think he would want us to be somewhere safe and happy. The question is whether this is where we belong." Emma leaned against her mother's shoulder, listening to the night sounds of the village settling into sleep. "Ayana says her people believe that sometimes the spirits guide us to where we need to be, even if we don't understand why. Maybe Papa guided us here." The wisdom in her daughter's words struck Sarah with surprising force. Perhaps there was truth in the Cahto belief that events unfolded according to purposes beyond human understanding. Their rescue had certainly seemed miraculous, and the acceptance they had found here defied all her previous experiences with cultural differences. As they sat together by the flowing water, Sarah began to understand that her decision was not really about choosing between two different futures. It was about accepting the path that had already been chosen for them through a series of events that had brought them to this place of unexpected safety and belonging. The sound of footsteps on the path behind them announced Katsuka's approach. He moved quietly, as was his way, but made enough noise to avoid startling them. His presence had become comforting to Sarah over the past weeks, representing security and understanding in a world that had shown her too much of both. "Thoughts heavy tonight?" he asked, settling on a nearby stone without invitation, but also without presumption. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice immediately. When she finally spoke, the words came slowly, carefully chosen. "I keep thinking about what's best for Emma, what Thomas would have wanted for us, what's right for your people who have been so kind." Katsuka was quiet for a moment, watching the water flow past in the moonlight. "My wife died when Ayana was born," he said finally. "For a long time, I thought only about protecting her, keeping her safe from world that might hurt her because she different. But Wiot taught me that protection without growth is like keeping plant in dark place, safe, but not alive." He gestured toward Emma, who was listening intently despite the late hour. "Your daughter grows here like plant in good soil, happy, learning, becoming strong. This is not accident, I think." Sarah felt the truth of his words settling in her chest like warmth from a fire. Emma was indeed growing and flourishing in ways that seemed impossible just weeks before. Perhaps that was answer enough to her questions about the future. The decision that had seemed so complex began to clarify as they sat together in the peaceful night. Some choices, Sarah realized, made themselves through the accumulation of small moments and gradual understanding rather than dramatic decisions. Her heart had already chosen. Her mind just needed time to catch up. As they prepared to return to their respective homes, Katsuka spoke once more, his voice carrying the weight of promise. "Whatever you choose, you and Emma have place here. Family protects family no matter what comes." His words carried Sarah into sleep that night, with a sense of peace she hadn't felt since before the attack that changed everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight she could rest in the certainty that they were no longer alone in the world. 3 months had passed since Sarah and Emma's arrival in the Cahto village, and the rhythm of their new life had become as natural as breathing. Sarah had learned to weave baskets from river reeds, to prepare acorn flour, and to identify the medicinal plants that grew in the surrounding forest. Her hands, once soft from indoor life, had grown strong and capable from the practical work of village life. Emma had become almost indistinguishable from the other village children in her confidence and joy. She spoke Cahto fluently now, mixing it naturally with English in conversations that delighted the adults around her. Under Ayana's patient guidance, she had learned to navigate not just the village paths, but also the surrounding forest trails, developing an independence that filled Sarah's heart with pride and amazement. The integration had not been without challenges. Some of the older villagers remained cautious about the presence of white settlers, remembering past conflicts and broken promises. A few young warriors questioned Katsuka's decision openly, arguing that harboring whites would eventually bring trouble to their peaceful community. But the chief's authority remained strong, and Sarah's genuine efforts to contribute and adapt had won over most skeptics. The seasonal salmon run had brought prosperity and celebration to the village, with the river running silver with fish returning to spawn. Sarah had learned to prepare and preserve fish in the traditional manner, working alongside the other women in the communal effort that would provide protein through the coming winter. Emma helped by sorting the dried fish and listening for the subtle differences in sound that indicated proper preservation. It was during these peaceful days of plenty that the first warning signs appeared. Scouts reported unusual activity to the north, where the territory bordered land increasingly claimed by white settlers. Smoke had been seen rising from areas where no villages existed, and the tracks of many horses had been found near water sources traditionally used by the Cahto for hunting and gathering. Katsuka called a council meeting to discuss these developments, his face grave with concern. Sarah attended as had become customary, her understanding of both cultures sometimes providing valuable insights into the motivations and likely actions of the encroaching settlers. The discussion was lengthy and complex, touching on whether to send envoys, increase patrols, or simply wait and hope the activity would pass by their territory. The debate was interrupted by the arrival of a scout running hard from the northern borders. He spoke rapidly to the chief in urgent tones, his words causing immediate tension among the council members. Sarah couldn't follow the rapid dialogue, but the expressions around the circle told her the news was serious. Katsuka turned to address the council in English, including Sarah in the discussion out of respect for her presence and perspective. "Soldiers come from north," he said grimly. 20 men, maybe more. They ask questions in villages about white woman and child, offer reward for information. Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins. Somehow, word of their presence had reached the outside world, and now armed men were actively searching for them. She thought immediately of the 2 raiders who had escaped during their rescue, realizing they must have reported the incident and perhaps identified her and Emma as valuable prizes worth pursuing. "They are not official soldiers," the scout added in broken English. "Same type as ones we fought before. Men who live by taking from others." The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. The surviving raiders had not simply fled and forgotten their losses. They had organized a larger force and returned, using her and Emma as justification for armed incursion into Cahto territory. Her presence here, meant to be temporary sanctuary, had become a threat to everyone who had shown them kindness. The council erupted in heated discussion, with voices raised in anger and concern. Some demanded that Sarah and Emma be immediately escorted away from the village to prevent conflict. Others argued for preparing defenses and protecting their adopted family members. Still others suggested attempting negotiation with the approaching force. Sarah stood slowly, her heart pounding with the weight of decision and responsibility. "This is my fault," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the debate. "I brought this danger to your people. Emma and I should leave immediately, before they arrive." Katsuka raised his hand for silence, his dark eyes fixed on Sarah's face. "Where would you go? 2 women alone in wilderness? 1 blind child? This is death sentence, not solution." "Better that than bringing war to your village," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "You saved us once. I won't let our presence destroy everything you've built here." Wiyot spoke firmly from her position in the circle. "Child belongs to village now. We do not abandon family because of outside threats." The elderly woman's declaration carried the weight of cultural law, and several council members nodded in agreement. But Sarah could see the division in the group, the difficult position her presence had created for these peaceful people who lived by codes of both hospitality and practical survival. Emma, who had been playing with other children nearby, appeared at Sarah's side with the uncanny timing she had developed for sensing emotional crisis. She took her mother's hand and spoke quietly in Cahto, words she had learned from Ayana about family and belonging. Even without understanding the language completely, the council members could hear the child's plea not to be separated from her new community. Katsuka stood and addressed the council with the authority of his position. "We prepare for defense, but we also prepare for talk. Sometimes words prevent bloodshed better than arrows. Sarah knows these men's language and customs. Maybe understanding helps more than fighting." The decision was made to prepare for multiple possibilities while scouts continued monitoring the approaching raiders' progress. Warriors began checking weapons and defensive positions while elders gathered the children and non-combatants in the most protected areas of the village. Sarah found herself torn between gratitude for their loyalty and guilt over the danger her presence had brought. That evening, as the village settled into tense preparation for conflict, Sarah and Emma walked together along their favorite path by the river. The familiar sounds of flowing water and evening birds seemed precious now, possibly among their last peaceful moments in this place that had become home. "Are we going to have to leave, Mama?" Emma asked, her young voice carrying the weight of someone who had already experienced too much loss and upheaval. Sarah struggled for words that would be honest without being terrifying. "Some dangerous men are looking for us, sweetheart. The people here want to protect us, but that might put them in danger too." Emma was quiet for several minutes, processing this information with the thoughtful intelligence that continued to amaze her mother. When she spoke again, her words came with unexpected wisdom. "Ayana told me that her father's job is to protect everyone in the village, even if it's hard. Maybe our job is to help him do that, even if it's scary." The simple clarity of her daughter's perspective cut through Sarah's emotional confusion like sunlight through clouds. Emma was right. Running away would solve nothing and would likely result in their deaths in the wilderness. Staying and facing the threat together offered the best chance for everyone's survival, even if it required courage Sarah wasn't sure she possessed. The raiders arrived 2 days later, approaching the village with the arrogance of men accustomed to intimidating those weaker than themselves. From her hiding place with the other women and children, Sarah could see them clearly as they rode into the central area where Katsuka waited with a small group of his warriors. The leader was a different man than the one from the original raider band, larger and more heavily armed. with the cruel confidence that came from successful violence. He carried himself like someone who had never met resistance he couldn't overcome through brutality and superior firepower. "We're looking for a white woman and her kid," he announced loudly, his voice carrying clearly across the village. "Word is they're being held here against their will. We've come to take them back to civilization where they belong." Katsuka replied calmly in English, his posture relaxed but alert. "No prisoners here, only family and guests who come freely, stay freely." The raider leader laughed harshly. "That's not what we heard. See, we have witnesses say you attacked white men and stole their property. That makes you hostiles, and us legally justified in whatever actions we take to recover stolen goods." Sarah felt sick at hearing herself and Emma referred to as property, but she also recognized the calculated nature of the raiders' claim. By framing their search as a rescue mission and portraying the Cahto as aggressors, they were creating justification for violence that might otherwise be condemned by authorities. "You may search village," Katsuka offered diplomatically. "See for yourself. No prisoners, no stolen goods, only people living in peace." The raiders accepted this invitation with obvious suspicion, spreading out to examine the village systematically. Sarah watched from her concealment as they moved through the community, their behavior growing more aggressive when they failed to find immediate evidence of white captives. One of the raiders approached the area where the women and children were sheltering, his eyes scanning the faces looking for the prizes he sought. Sarah knew that discovery was inevitable. Her appearance would never allow her to blend in with the Cahto women, and Emma's features carried too much of her father's European heritage to pass unnoticed. The moment of recognition came when the raider's gaze fell on Emma, who was sitting close beside Ayana near the back of the group. Even without seeing her eyes clearly, something about the child's features triggered his awareness. He called out to his leader, pointing in their direction. "Found them! Woman and kid! Right there!" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as all eyes turned toward their hiding place. Around her, the Cahto women shifted protectively, forming a barrier between the raiders and their adopted family members. But she knew the gesture was futile. Violence was now inevitable unless she acted. Standing slowly, Sarah moved forward through the group of women, her chin raised with as much dignity as she could muster. Emma tried to follow, but Ayana gently restrained her, whispering words of comfort while keeping the child safe behind the line of protection. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she announced clearly, stepping into the open area where the confrontation was taking place. "This is my daughter, Emma. What do you want with us?" The raider leader's grin was triumphant and cruel. "Well now, that makes things simple. You're coming with us, lady. You and the kid. Time to get back to your own kind." Katsuka moved slightly, positioning himself between Sarah and the raiders without making it an obvious threat. "She free to choose, not prisoner, not forced to stay or go." "Choice?" The raider spat on the ground. "What choice does a white woman have living with savages? You people probably been keeping her as a slave, using her for whatever purposes suited you. We're here to rescue her from that life." Sarah felt anger flare in her chest at the assumptions and prejudice dripping from the man's words. These people had saved her life, treated her with respect and kindness, and given her daughter opportunities for growth and happiness she had never imagined possible. To hear their generosity characterized as enslavement and abuse was almost unbearable. "You're wrong," she said firmly. "These people saved us from men like you. They've treated us better than our own kind ever did. We're not prisoners. We're family." The raider leader's expression darkened with anger and frustration. "Stockholm Syndrome," he declared dismissively. "Common thing with captives who've been held too long. You don't know what's good for you anymore. But don't worry. We'll help you remember." He gestured to his men, several of whom began advancing towards Sarah with clear intent to take her by force. The Cahto warriors tensed in response, hands moving toward weapons despite being outnumbered and outgunned. The situation was rapidly approaching the point where violence would become inevitable. It was then that Emma broke free from Ayanna's protective grasp and ran toward the confrontation, her remarkable navigation skills allowing her to move quickly despite her blindness. She reached Sarah's side and wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, her young voice carrying clearly across the tense silence. "Mama, don't let them take us away from home." The word home struck everyone present with unexpected force. Here was a blind child, vulnerable and dependent, declaring her allegiance to the people who had embraced her rather than the culture she had been born into. Her courage in the face of obvious danger spoke more powerfully than any adult argument about where her heart truly belonged. The raider leader stepped forward aggressively, reaching toward Emma with obvious intent to grab her. "Come on, kid. Time to go back where you belong." Sarah instinctively moved to shield her daughter, putting herself between Emma and the threatening stranger. In that instant, Katsuka raised his bow. An arrow knocked and ready to fly. Around the clearing, his warriors followed suit, their weapons aimed at the raiders who suddenly found themselves targets rather than aggressors. The tableau held for a moment that stretched like eternity. Armed men facing each other across a space that contained a mother protecting her blind child from those who would tear her away from the only safety and happiness she had known in her young life. Then Katsuka looked at Sarah, really looked at her, seeing in that moment the same desperate protective love he carried for his own daughter. He saw a mother who would die before allowing harm to come to her child, who had found the strength to face armed men for the sake of her daughter's well-being. He saw himself reflected in her fierce determination to protect the vulnerable innocent in her care. Slowly, deliberately, Katsuka lowered his bow. The weapon fell from his hands to the ground at his feet, the arrow spilling harmlessly onto the earth. Around the clearing, his warriors followed their chief's lead, setting down their weapons in a gesture that was both surrender and profound statement of principle. The raider leader stared in confusion at this unexpected development. He had been prepared for resistance, for the violent confrontation that would justify his actions and allow him to take what he wanted through superior force. But this quiet laying down of arms in the face of overwhelming odds confused him, making his next actions somehow more difficult rather than easier. "What kind of trick is this?" he demanded, his voice uncertain for the first time since arriving. Katsuka stood empty-handed but with unshakable dignity. "No trick. You have guns, we have bows. You win fight, maybe kill some of us. But what you win? Woman who hates you, child who fears you, people who remember your cruelty. This is victory?" He gestured toward Sarah and Emma, still clinging together in the center of the confrontation. "Look at them. Really look. You see prisoners? You see people who want rescue?" For the first time, the raider leader actually examined the scene before him with something approaching objectivity. He saw a woman dressed in native clothing but clean and well-fed, standing protectively over a child who was obviously healthy and unafraid of the people surrounding them. He saw Cahto villagers who had risked their lives rather than simply hand over the captives he had come to retrieve. Sarah seized the moment of uncertainty, stepping forward with Emma still in her arms. "We're not prisoners," she said clearly. "We're here by choice. My daughter is thriving here, learning and growing in ways she never could in your world. These people saved our lives and gave us a home when we had nothing." She looked directly at the raider leader, her fear transformed into fierce determination. "If you try to take us by force, you'll be the ones committing the crime of kidnapping. We've chosen our family, and we choose to stay with them." Emma lifted her head from her mother's embrace and spoke in clear, unafraid tones. "This is where we belong. These are our people now." The simple declaration from the blind child seemed to carry more weight than all the adult arguments. Here was someone completely vulnerable, dependent on others for survival, choosing to trust the very people the raiders claimed were her captors. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Several of the raiders shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about the morality of forcibly removing people who claimed not to want rescue. They had signed on for what was presented as a legitimate recovery mission, not a kidnapping operation against unwilling victims. The leader sensed the erosion of support among his men and made one final attempt to salvage his mission. "You can't just decide to go native," he declared angrily. "You're white. You belong with your own kind. That kid needs proper schooling, proper medicine, proper everything." Wyatt stepped forward from the group of elders, her ancient dignity commanding attention even from these violent strangers. In careful English, she addressed the raider directly. "Child learns here every day. Learns plants that heal, stories that teach wisdom, skills that make her strong. She happy, she safe, she loved. What more does proper mean?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that went beyond the immediate confrontation. What indeed did proper mean when it came to raising a child? Was it the social conventions of a culture that often saw Emma's blindness as a limitation to be hidden? Or was it the acceptance and empowerment she had found among people who valued her for who she was rather than what she lacked? The raider leader looked around at his men and saw doubt spreading through their ranks. This was not the simple snatch-and-grab operation he had promised them. These people were not the savage kidnappers he had described. The situation had become complicated in ways that made violence seem less like justice and more like brutality. Gradually, reluctantly, he began to accept that his mission had failed. Not through superior force or clever tactics, but through the simple power of a family's love and a community's willingness to sacrifice for their chosen members. "This ain't over," he said finally, but the threat lacked conviction. "Authorities are going to hear about this situation. Official people will come asking questions." Katsuka nodded calmly. "They welcome to come. They will see same thing you see. Free people, choosing their own path, harming no one." The raiders departed as they had arrived, with bluster and display, but their departure carried the taste of defeat rather than victory. They had failed to accomplish their goal not because they were outfought, but because they were proven wrong about the fundamental nature of the situation they had come to address. As the sound of their horses faded into the distance, the village began to return to normal activity. The crisis had passed, but it had also clarified something important about the choices that had been made and the loyalties that had been forged. That evening, as the community gathered for the meal that celebrated both their safety and their unity, Sarah found herself thinking about the moment when Katsuka had dropped his weapon. It had been more than a tactical decision. It had been an act of profound recognition, an acknowledgement that some things were worth more than victory in battle. He had seen in her protective love for Emma the same fierce devotion that drove his own care for Ayana, and in that recognition, he had found something more powerful than weapons. The willingness to be vulnerable in defense of what mattered most had proven stronger than the threat of force. Emma sat between Sarah and Ayana at the evening fire, chattering happily about the day's events, with the resilience that children brought to even the most frightening situations. She was home, safe among people who valued her exactly as she was, and that knowledge gave her a confidence that no amount of specialized education or conventional medicine could have provided. As the fire burned low and the village settled into peaceful sleep, Sarah understood that they had found something rare and precious in this place, not just safety or acceptance, but genuine belonging that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture. They had become family in the truest sense. People who would sacrifice for each other without question, who valued each other's well-being above their own convenience or comfort. The future would bring other challenges, other moments when their choices would be tested. But they would face those challenges together, as a family bound not by blood or convention, but by love, freely given and gratefully received. In a world often divided by fear and prejudice, they had created something beautiful and lasting, a home where love mattered more than appearances, where acceptance was complete, and where every member was valued for their unique gifts rather than judged by their perceived limitations. Emma's laughter rang out across the village as Ayanna told her a story in their shared language of growing sisterhood, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that they had found their place in the world. Not the place others might have chosen for them, but the place where their hearts belonged, where their spirits could grow, and where love was the only law that truly mattered.